morning, good afternoon, good evening. Zimbabwe is a failed state. I've said this so many times. Some people have been asking me, why do I keep repeating it? Well, I'm repeating it because it is true. I'm also repeating it because it needs to be said. Zimbabwe is not going to get out of this mess without facing the truth and dealing with it. We must face the truth. Here is a short video clip of the late Dr. Joshua Nkomo, Zimbabwe's nationalist, underlying the root cause of Zimbabwe, why Zimbabwe is a failed state. Violence. The failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections. My apologies. Just need to find the clip. There we are.
We have people beating up people. Why must people beat each other? Why must people beat the next person? Why must you teach people to hate? This is no time to teach people to hate each other. This is the time to teach people to respect each other, to accept each other, not to hate, not to roar, not to kill. It is because we don't understand. Nobody must go about running around with grenades and with AKs at this time to try and persuade people by means of that. If you go about running around with AKs to persuade people, because we have no support. If you have support, you don't do things like that.
Well, that is very true. But when you cannot guarantee that support, you need to do that. In 1980, Zanu PF would have preferred the Lancaster House constitution to have created and delivered a de jure one-party state. It was not to be. The Lancaster House constitution delivered a multi-party democracy. And Zanu PF agreed to that. But before the ink was even dry, the party was already plotting on how it was going to undermine democracy. The agreement at the Lancaster House said that all Zanu PF and PF ZAPU were to withdraw all their freedom fighter operatives from the field to assembly points during the election period. Zanu PF withdrew some, but not all of them. And those who were left in the field, they were given very specific instructions that they were to tell the people that if Zanu PF does not win the elections, the Bush war would continue. The people, of course, voted to end the Bush war. And when Zanu PF got his feet under the desk, from there on to systematically create a de facto one-party state that has ruled the country to this day. Zimbabwe has never held free, fair, and credible elections. Never. The nearest time the country ever got to holding free, fair, and credible elections was 2008. After SADC had dwelled on Zanu PF to change the electoral process to make it more free, fair, and credible. And the people jumped at that opportunity. The 2008 elections were held with the background of the country's economy in total meltdown. The regime had just seized the white-owned farms with the collapse of the country's agricultural sector, and with it, the economy. The country's Reserve Bank Governor, Gideon Gono, was on a money printing spree in which the country, fueling the country's inflation to a nauseating 500 billion%. The prices were changing so fast that if you went into the shops and pick up something with a price tag on it, by the time you get to the till, you'll be told the price has changed. That's how fast prices were changing. That's unbelievable. It became so difficult to do business that most shops, even the big shops like OK, were empty. The shelves were empty. The economy was in total meltdown. And naturally, of course, the people seized on it and were hoping to finally have regime change, thanks to SADC's efforts to make sure that the election were free, fair, and credible. And the people, of course, voted to have regime change. Mnangagwa, yes, the same Emerson Lambuzo Mnangagwa, who is today masquerading as the country's president, when he saw that Zanu PF was losing those elections, he stepped in, instructed SADC to stop announcing the results. Here is Mnangagwa boasting about it.
2008 patakaita ma-elections pakaposa papinda Tsvangirai ndandiri election agent ya president. Ma-results abuda tiri party headquarters vamutasa vanga vari secretary vedu ve-administration vamutasa muripi yafona ndiri kwarusapi komo kuenda kwarusapi seka ma-results achibuda kudai vanga aiwa zvako izvo Mnangagwa ndezvako endaenda kumusha ofisi vanga vabisa zvinhu zvavo zvose watofunga kuti zani yadini yaparara. President ofona zvakamira sei kati ndomamira zvakaita takatodini kateda sei manje mama ndikati abvudzai baba nditaurira baba gadzirai politburo cabinet musarangarira zvimwe zvinhu gadzirai chi cabinet asi nangoda kuti muzive kuti 2008 ma-results abuda vamutasa vakatiza.
As a country we face a generational transition. Vana vesa vari kuma below 35, they are crying out for help. The country is in a mess. Arusurufaro. We know we are inheriting a mess. We know this country has been left with nothing.
I'm assuring you that starting from tomorrow, you'll see a different nation from what you have seen or read on the news about these results and everything. Where we are going ahead there, the situation will be very different. What we said to our people, they could not see with their own eyes. We're going to act as we see it fit. We're prepared to go the whole distance.
Yes, a staggering 500 people were killed that year in the worst wanton violence in the country's electoral history. Even SADC could not stomach it. And they denied the regime political legitimacy, Zanu PF political legitimacy, which forced the regime to go into the 2008 to 2013 GNU, Government of National Unity. It is a pity that the opportunity to change, to implement democratic reform and end the Zanu PF dictatorship was wasted. Morgan Tsvangirai, whom we saw in the video clip there, failed to implement even one token democratic reform in 5 years of the GNU. Mugabe bribed Tsvangirai and company with trappings of high office. And the rest, as they say, is history. And so today, we are still stuck with a corrupt, tyrannical, and murderous Zanu PF regime because it's able to rig elections. Zanu PF rigged last year's elections. Let's be very clear on that. Here is Tondrila explaining what we are talking about here when we're talking of Zimbabwe has failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections.
SADC Treaty. We go back a long way to the creation of SADC, ahead of the liberation of South Africa, all the way back to 1992. And as one understands it, the idea was to create an integrated community built around a treaty, and a treaty that had certain obligations. And those obligations were spelled out very clearly in the original SADC Treaty as amended in 2005 and later on. And they state them in very clear ways. But I want to start with a notion about where we stand in an understanding of SADC from the outside. Here, I'm drawing on the varieties of democracy, VDEM, in their latest report, and how they classify democracy within SADC. And they use a four-part classification: liberal democracy, electoral autocracy, and closed autocracy. And as you can see, of the SADC countries, only Seychelles is given the moniker of being a liberal democracy. 7 countries are given the notion of electoral democracy, which means that they basically adhere to the notion of free and fair elections, and most of the things that we agree are part of democracy are present in those countries. And then there are countries that they call electoral autocracies. And these are countries in which elections are held. They generally don't meet the criteria of free and fair according to international classifications, but also to SADC classifications. And we'll come back to that in a minute. And that includes Angola, Comoros, DRC, etc., etc. And then finally, Eswatini, which is described as a closed autocracy. So the view of where countries now are viewed internationally within SADC is very mixed. Now, in SADC itself, in the treaty, and we think about these principles of democracy, they lay out in those original principles, Chapter 3, Article 4, the principles by which SADC should operate. This goes all the way back 30 years and is repeated endlessly in all the subsequent versions of it. Sovereign equality of all member states. And I want to emphasize this notion of sovereign because it's something at the devil's SADC. Solidarity, peace, and security, and importantly, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. And that's a very important set of principles there because those apply materially, not merely to elections, but they apply to how a country behaves in the interregnum between elections and as a whole. And equity, balance, and mutual benefit. And they're talking very much there about the economic principles behind developing this economic community. And then finally, peaceful settlement of disputes. Now, one of the key things, obviously, about countries within a community that's rule-bound and treaty-bound is that one of the key issues is an election. Because an election that puts a party into power and gives them legality and legitimacy. Legitimacy defined by the fact that the people agree with the result, and legality, obviously, that it meets all the rules of the game in an election. And to that end, SADC set up a set of principles, the SADC principles of treaty. Let me go back for 1 second. I want to make this point, and that is that in a rule-bound community, the reason rules are there is to ensure compliance with them, to these 5 principles there: sovereignty, solidarity, human rights, etc. And that means when the rules are breached and the principles are breached, there must be consequences. And SADC thought about this. And to that end, in the treaty, in Article 33, they mentioned that dreaded word sanctions may be imposed against any member state that persistently fails without good reason to fulfill obligations or implements policies which undermine the principles and objectives of SADC.
I'll stop right there. It is a fact that Zanu PF rigged the 2023 elections. Those elections were not free, fair, and credible. And SADC's own election observer team noted that Zimbabwe's elections were not free, fair, and credible. They failed to meet Zimbabwe's own constitutional requirements, electoral laws, and what Tony Rila is talking about here, SADC's own principles and, and guidelines on free, fair, and credible elections. This is important. This is at the heart of why SADC's report concluded that the elections were flawed and illegitimate. It is a pity that instead of accepting its own failures, Zanu PF's reaction to it, of course, was to reject that and to pretend that the regime can somehow bamboozle everybody into submission. SADC is going to hold its summit in a few days' time. And at that summit, the summit will be held in Harare. And after that summit, Mnangagwa will become the chairman of the regional body. Many people in Zimbabwe, of course, accept that the elections were rigged. And they were going to demonstrate, to make that point. And the regime reaction to that was to deploy the security services to make sure that there are no such demonstrations. This is what all this beehive activity by the regime has been all about, to make sure that no one reminds Mnangagwa or the visitors that he rigged the elections. The truth is, the SADC leaders already know that, because the SADC election report, which I'm showing the conclusion of one part at least of that conclusion on the screen, clearly state that those elections were flawed. Here is Mnangagwa boasting about how he doesn't care what anybody else says. He insists the elections were free, fair, and credible.
Vana vakatuka Zanu PF kana ini ndonyanyisa kufara kuita zvakanaka. Ukavona vavengi vakwashi kurumbidza nekuchikanganisa. Ukavona vachiti Zanu PF yakaipa farai. You are doing correct things for your country. Hongu takaita maelections edu kuna vamwe vaitaura zvisina musoro zvikanzi maelections anafamba zvakanaka ndezvavo.
Of course, it's nonsense. We can't say that SADC and the AU, who condemned those elections as flawed and illegal, are our enemies too. The regime dismissed the West when they said the elections were not free, fair, and credible. And now it's dismissing the regional body and the continental body. We will end up with a situation here where we have absolutely at loggerheads with everybody. The truth of the matter is, Zimbabwe is a failed state because we have failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections. It is heartbreaking that 44 years after independence, we are still struggling to define what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections and meeting those requirements. Not for somebody else, for ourselves. We're not doing somebody a favor here by holding free, fair, and credible elections. This is for the good of Zimbabwe. I think that is a fundamental point that we must emphasize here. It is a pity, it is really tragic that after all the bitter years of the War of Independence, we find ourselves still fighting for the same freedoms and fundamental rights that we went to war about. All we succeeded in doing in 1980 is remove the white colonial oppressor, only to replace them with the Zanu PF oppressors. Zanu PF would want to say Zimbabwe is now a democracy. It is not. It is an autocracy. We went to war. One of the very basic requirements to fight against white colonial rule was that people wanted a meaningful say in the governance of the country. The whites denied blacks a vote. And since 1980, we have had a vote, but a totally diluted vote. In Zimbabwe, your vote does not count unless it's a vote for Zanu PF. And the regime has come up, devised many devilish ways of denying the ordinary people their vote, and if need be, manufacturing fictitious votes to secure electoral victory. It is a pity that we are where we are. How do we go from here? We are preparing for 2028 elections. I do not see Zanu PF implementing reforms. Zanu PF will never reform itself out of office. That is a fact that most Zimbabweans accepted as far back as the late 1990s, when MDC was launched to answer the nation's cry for democratic change. I do not see the few MPs, CCC MPs who are in parliament today, in any way pushing for democratic reforms. Indeed, Chamisa and company will never deliver any meaningful democratic change in Zimbabwe, because they failed to do so when they had the golden chance to do it in the GNU of 2008 to 2018. Ever since the GNU, MDC/CCC have been participating in flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy out of greed for a share of the spoils of power. Last year, even after SADC and the AU had condemned the election as flawed, CCC candidates who had won the few seats in those elections, including the likes of Fazai Mayer, David Coulthard, etc., all took up their seats, insisting that those elections, in those areas where they'd won, the election process was free, fair, and credible. In reality, they were doing it out of greed. And it is a pity that some people continue to deny that reality. The failure to accept that the opposition, although the people have risked all to elect them, for the primary purpose they would implement democratic reforms to stop Zanu PF breaking the elections. The opposition have sold out. 24 years, and they have not implemented even one token reform. And still some people continue to blindly follow them. That has not helped our cause, our fight to end the Zanu PF dictatorship, because the opposition are now the ones keeping Zanu PF in power. It is an outrage that anyone would still pretend that Chamisa did not lie about plugging all the vote rigging loopholes last year to con people to participate in those flawed elections. And yet, many people will deny it. Worse still, Chamisa will resurface and will mobilize the same people, nearly 2 million of them, to participate in 2028 elections with no reforms implemented. I believe it was the participation of Zimbabweans in their millions in last year's elections that in part stopped SADC imposing any form of sanctions against Zanu PF. How could they? If Zimbabweans themselves are happy to participate in flawed elections in their millions, what can SADC do? If we participate in 2028 in the same numbers, in our millions, I believe SADC will find it very difficult to punish vote rigging Zanu PF in any way. In any case, SADC will also face the reality that even if they were to sanction Zanu PF, to what end and purpose? If all they can do is have another government of national unity, as they did in 2008, and that GNU, the main actors are Zanu PF and CCC, the same people who failed to implement even one token reform in 2008 to 2013. What hope is there that they will implement reforms now? That is a question that SADC will find themselves having to answer. And if I was in their shoes, I too would be tempted to say, if Zimbabweans participate in 2028 in their millions, after we have told them they need to implement reforms, they had the chance to implement the reforms in the last GNU and they failed to do so. And last year, the SADC election observer team told them you need to implement reforms. And the people of Zimbabwe keep ignoring them. What else do you want SADC to do? I'll close and leave the last word to the SADC chairperson, advising the people of Zimbabwe on that very point, the need to implement reforms before 2028 elections. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Have a good day.
Well, thank you so much. First of all, let me be clear that the changing of any dynamic or situation in any of our African countries is a preserve of the citizens of that country, in this case, the Zimbabwean people. An election observation team goes there to support the process by observing and being able to release a statement of our observations that, for instance, in Zimbabwe, we raised several issues of transparency and also the independence of the Electoral Commission, Commission and things which happen in many other countries, you know. But at the end of the day, once we produce the report and make it available to the Zimbabwean authorities and eventually to the Zimbabwean people, it really remains the preserve of the Zimbabwean people to fight for the freedoms that they need themselves and to correct those issues that have been observed. The reason why we have multiple observation missions is to ensure that, you know, there's a comparison, you know, taking place between the SADC report and the European Union report, the African Union report, and then they can see that those issues that repeat themselves in all these reports, it's up to the Zimbabwean people. And this is where I appeal to all political leaders, not only in Zimbabwe, especially the elections that are coming in Mozambique, that are coming in South Africa, in DRC. We have to make up our minds that, look, at the end of the day, once the people in the country are given an opportunity to monitor the elections, because they also monitor, it starts not during the day of the elections. They must make sure that the constitutional lacunas that can affect a good election are dealt with months before the election. And they must fight to ensure that there's a level playing field. They should never wait for the time when the election is taking place. They must also insist that the electoral commissions and the governments in those countries abide by international norms in holding democratic elections. And this fight must be more vicious before the election comes.
Thank you. The last word is we must fight to have the reforms implemented so that we have free, fair, and credible elections. Failure to do so, at least let's have the common sense to stop participating in a flawed process to give Zanu PF legitimacy. Thank you very much, and have a good day.